Hello, class. You've caught me on this fine evening. I am just sitting on a couch, thinking about you guys, and I thought, what better way to start off a Thanksgiving break than with a rousing discussion of American history? And since this is basically our last week, I thought I'd just give you one last video lecture. Um, so history does not end in 1980, and I wanted to kind of cover the last 30 years, what has happened, what we've seen. And I hope you'll be patient with me because a lot of this is a little bit of mental therapy for me because I've lived through a lot of what we're going to be talking about. Um, we'll start with 1980, and probably the most prominent event that happened was the election of Ronald Reagan, which we talked about in our last lesson. This is known as the Reagan Revolution, the rise of Reagan, Reagan era, whatever you want to call it. I call it the 1980s, but a lot happened during that time. Excuse me. So Reagan was elected as a charismatic conservative. He was a former actor, so he was very good at speaking and presenting himself. He was good looking, he was friendly, he was approachable. So he had that sort of Hollywood demeanor, but also he appealed to just the everyday person. Um, he was so good at communicating and getting his point across that they gave him this really clever title called the Great Communicator. He won people over easily, and he had this very charming and charismatic personality, but he could also turn on a dime and become this sort of no nonsense enforcer, and that appealed to a lot of people at that time. So his administration, his time as president, is characterized by a few things. Probably the most prominent thing that people talk about is his economic policies, which most people call Reaganomics. So you've probably heard of this. Reaganomics is just sort of another word for trickle-down economics. We hear it a lot in the political arena. Um, I don't know that the ideas that Reagan put out for the economy were that pioneering or that revolutionary, but they came across as such. We see a lot of it during the Gilded Age in the 1920s. Um, and so trickle down economics is this idea that if you deregulate businesses and, uh, sorry, if you deregulate different businesses and companies and the market in general, then the capital that those businesses bring in will eventually make its way down to the middle and lower classes. So it's all about slashing taxes, and it sort of worked. The economy did come out of a terrible recession. The 1970s was all about a bad, unhealthy economy, and during the 80s it starts to recover, and Reagan gets a lot of credit for that. Um, So the other part of his Reaganomics ideas were to cut government spending, which meant that you had to cut a lot of social programs um, and turn a lot of government duties over to private corporations. So programs like food stamps and public health issues or programs were slashed, and that's pretty significant because prior to this time, you didn't see a lot of homeless World War I or World War II or Korean War veterans. But then in the 80s and 90s and even today, there are a lot of homeless veterans, and a lot of people attribute that to the slashing of public um, health programs from the 1980s. Also, Reagan was, or he portrayed himself as a Cold War fighter. Um, he spent a ton of money on national defense, including one program called Star Wars, which was not nearly as fun as the movies. The idea was to develop a missile defense system in space so that could track incoming warheads and blow them up before they were able to do any damage. Um, the idea was pretty far-fetched. Not a lot of people took it seriously, but the Reagan administration pushed it hard and spent a lot of money developing it. And they pushed it so much that the USSR, Soviet Union, was afraid that it would start a new arms race. Uh, so all of the spending cuts that Reagan enacted against social programs and slashing taxes, all those things were kind of nullified by spending on national defense. So speaking of the USSR, Reagan started off his administration as a Cold War fighter, but over the course of the decade, he actually built a very solid uh, relationship with the leader of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev. They signed a lot of treaties together. They actually enacted some disarmament policies or treaties, and Reagan ultimately softened his stance on Russia after declaring them the empire of evil, or an evil empire, at the beginning of the decade. But perhaps the biggest controversy of the Reagan administration is known as the Iran-Contra affair. And it's really bizarre and complicated, but essentially what happened was there were hostages being held by Iranian terrorists in Lebanon. So you had terrorists from Iran in the country of Lebanon holding 7 American hostages. So Reagan makes it a personal point to bring those hostages home. And as a result, he begins negotiations with Iran. Iran says, we'll let the hostages go if you sell us weapons that we can use to fight Iraq. So this was before the Gulf War, so things with Iraq, the relationship with Iraq was a lot different than it was during the 90s and the early 2000s. So Reagan says, okay, let's do it. So he sells arms to Iran, and he thought that this would give him a strong ally with Iran, but also strengthen the relationship with Lebanon. So, so he sells them arms. 3 of the hostages, I think, are actually freed. And then he uses the money, or his administration, I should say, uses the money that they got from the sale of those armaments to arm rebels in Nicaragua. So what's going on in Nicaragua is that it was under a communist regime, and these rebels were trying to fight. They were known as the Contras. They're fighting to get rid of this communist government, and so Reagan uses the funds from selling the weapons to Iran to fund these rebels. The problem was the Contras were drug dealers, and so if you know anything about Reagan's domestic policies, Nancy Reagan, his wife, was a strong advocate for anti-drug policies. She's the one that started the Just Say No campaign. And so when Congress finds out, Congress at the time is run by Democrats. Uh, they don't like that at all, that he's funding drug dealers. So this leads to a whole long process of government hearings, meetings, and charges. And so the whole thing eventually comes to a head in 1986, and for a time it looked like Reagan was in serious trouble and that he might lose the presidency. But he really wasn't. It never even came close. There were a lot of committee meetings. Reagan himself testified before Congress, but only a few low-level CIA people were ever arrested and served time. A bunch of higher-ups were charged, but they didn't really ever go to jail. And Reagan ended his presidency 2 years later as one of the most popular presidents in modern history. So Reagan also suffered a lot behind the scenes too. He was the oldest president ever elected, and he survived an assassination attempt, which I think took a lot out of him. During the later years of his presidency, He was known to get very tired and take naps and even forget things. And years later, come to find out that he was suffering from Alzheimer's, which would eventually kill him in 2004. So now we're getting into very significant historical events because I remember a lot of what happened. I don't remember Reagan, but I remember what happened after. Um, I think the first major historical event that I remember was when the Berlin Wall came down. I don't remember seeing it on the news, but I remember one of my teachers coming into class and saying, something amazing has happened. A big wall in a town called Berlin has just been taken down, and now half of a country is free. And that never really registered to me until a few years later. I saw a map of what used to be the USSR, and it used to be much bigger, taking up all of Eastern Europe, and now it's just the Russia that we know and love today. Uh, so I remember that. I remember Clinton winning the election in 1992 over George H.W. Bush. And then I remember the Oklahoma City bombing and learning that Timothy McVeigh had blown up a federal building because he didn't like what had happened during an FBI raid in Waco, Texas. I also remember the following election, 1996, when Clinton beat Bob Dole. And then, of course, I remember the Lewinsky scandal when Clinton was actually impeached. And the strange thing to me back then was Clinton was impeached, but he didn't leave office. And I couldn't wrap my head around that. He was guilty, but he wasn't. And, so politics was weird. Soon after that, I became very involved well, not involved, but a bit of a politics nerd. And in 2000, I remember staying up all night to hear the results of the Bush versus Gore election. And, by the time I fell asleep, of course, it wasn't resolved. It wouldn't be resolved for another few weeks. So that was a big moment in history that I remember. And then, of course, I remember 9/11, which was just devastating. I was in an auto shop, and some kid came in and started, shouting out all these rumors that we were under attack and things, and saying all these things that I just didn't believe. And coincidentally, it was my history teacher, my high school history teacher, who told me a little bit later that it was all true. That two planes had crashed into the World Trade Center towers and brought them down. A third plane crashed into the Pentagon, and a fourth had crashed in some field in Pennsylvania. And when I was 12, I actually saw the Twin Towers, and I remember how big they were and how cool they were. And then just the shock of knowing that they were suddenly gone. And it still shocks me that they're not there anymore. So my point is that while not everything we see nowadays is as dramatic as 9/11, we're living history right now. We see it every day in the news. Even just these little things, these minute things that seemingly have no consequences can send these ripples, right, that have a huge impact later on down the line. And one of my regrets about this class is that we have to focus on the big things. We don't get to really dig in deep to sort of the little things. And that's why I have you do these research projects, is so that you can dig down into the nitty-gritty, find little events that actually had huge ramifications. So now we're seeing history nowadays. We see it every day. And the question becomes, what do we do with it? We see shades of things that have happened in the past. And it's important to recognize those so that we can know how to handle it and find ways to deal with it and to help others to deal with it. So that's the big question I propose to all of you. We're witnessing history, and what are you going to do about it? So this isn't the last video announcement. We have one more week, next week, after Thanksgiving. I'm not going to post any more content, but I'll probably have another announcement to sort of sign things up and wrap everything together. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed my little therapy session here, and I hope you have a good Thanksgiving break.